My name is Alara Vance. For the first 18 years of my life, that name felt like a borrowed coat, one that was beautiful and warm but never quite fit my shoulders. I grew up in Port Blossom, a city that clings to the rugged coastline of the Pacific Northwest, a place where the scent of salt and pine needles hangs in the air like a perpetual mist. Our house, a sprawling cedar-sided home on a bluff overlooking the churning gray expanse of the ocean, was a reflection of the two people who raised me. My mother, Clara, filled it with life. She was the one who planted the riotous garden of hydrangeas and rhododendrons that cascaded down the hillside, who baked bread on rainy Saturdays until the windows steamed up with warmth, who believed every room needed a comfortable chair and a stack of books. Her love was an enveloping presence, as constant and comforting as the low hum of the foghorns in the bay. She was the one who chose me. I was 2 years old, a quiet, serious-faced toddler in the sterile file of an adoption agency, when she saw my photograph and declared, "That's her. That's our daughter." My father, Arthur, was a different kind of presence altogether. He was a man of quiet integrity and formidable intellect, a corporate attorney who moved through the world with a reserved and careful precision. His love was a more abstract concept, expressed in the security he provided, the high standards he set, and the silent approval in his eyes when I met them. While Clara's domain was the sun-drenched kitchen and the wild garden, Arthur's was his study, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and a heavy oak door that was almost always closed. He loved me, I believe, in the way one loves a valuable and important project, one he was committed to seeing through to a successful completion. Clara was the bridge between our two worlds. She would draw me into Arthur's study with a plate of warm cookies, coaxing him to talk about his day or listen to me read a new chapter from my favorite book. She translated his silences for me, explaining that his reserve was not a lack of feeling, but a deep-seated fear of loss that had been etched into him since his own parents died when he was a teenager. "He builds walls to keep the hurt out, sweetheart," she would say, tucking me into bed. "But your love is like the sea. Just keep lapping at the stones, and one day they'll soften." For 12 years, her presence was enough. Her warmth filled all the empty spaces. She taught me to see the beauty in a storm-tossed sea, to find solace in the quiet companionship of books, and to believe, with unwavering certainty, that I was wanted, chosen, loved. Then, when I was 14, the architect of our family, the bridge between our separate islands, began to crumble. The diagnosis was cancer. It was swift and merciless, a thief that stole her energy, her laughter, and finally, her breath. I spent the last few months of her life in the hushed, antiseptic quiet of hospital rooms, holding her hand as it grew thinner and more fragile with each passing day. The night she died, she pulled me close, her voice a faint whisper against the rhythmic beep of the machines. "Remember, my Alara," she said, her eyes, still so full of love, fixed on mine. "You are made of starlight and resilience. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. You were chosen." At her funeral, Arthur wept. Not with the quiet dignity I expected, but with raw, shuddering sobs that shook his entire body. I reached for his hand, wanting to offer the same comfort Clara had always given us both, but he flinched away, retreating back into the fortress of his grief. I realized then that he wasn't just mourning his wife, he was mourning his translator, his ambassador to the world of emotion. Without her, we were two strangers, adrift in a house that suddenly felt vast and silent, the echo of her absence in every empty room. The silence after Clara's death was a physical entity. It sat between us at the dinner table, a third, unwelcome guest. The vibrant colors of her garden seemed to fade. The house no longer smelled of baking bread, but of dust and disuse. I tried to fill the void, reporting on my grades and school activities like a subordinate giving a briefing, but Arthur would only nod, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond my shoulder. 6 months after the funeral, he brought Amelia home. She was nothing like Clara. Where my mother had been soft, Amelia was sharp angles and polished surfaces. She wore tailored business suits, and her laughter was a brittle, calculated sound. She ran a high-end interior design firm, and she looked at our warm, slightly worn home with the critical eye of a surgeon assessing a patient. "Oh, you must be the daughter," she'd said when we first met, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Arthur has told me so much about you." He hadn't, of course. I could see it in the way she fumbled for conversation, asking generic questions about my hobbies as if reading from a script. They married 8 months later in a small, sterile ceremony at the courthouse. I wore a simple navy dress Clara had bought me. Amelia, surveying my somber attire, remarked to a guest, loud enough for me to hear, she's still in her little gothic phase. We're hoping she grows out of it. Amelia's first project was to erase Clara from the house. The comfortable, overstuffed furniture was replaced with sleek, minimalist pieces that were beautiful to look at but impossible to relax on. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon was replaced by a cloying, chemical fragrance from expensive diffusers. The family photos of me as a toddler in Clara's arms, of the 3 of us on a beach vacation, were quietly moved from the living room mantelpiece to a dusty album in the back of a closet. In their place went professionally shot portraits of Arthur and Amelia, their smiles perfect and lifeless, like a marketing brochure for a life I no longer recognized. The final wall between Arthur and me was erected when I was 16. Amelia announced her pregnancy over a tense breakfast. She placed a perfectly manicured hand on her still flat stomach and beamed at Arthur. His face, which had been a mask of stoic grief for 2 years, broke open with a light I hadn't seen since before Clara got sick. It was pure, unadulterated joy. He swept Amelia into his arms, kissing her with a passion I had never witnessed. A second chance, he said later that evening, his hand resting protectively on Amelia's stomach. A chance to build a real family from the beginning. The words were not meant to be cruel, I don't think. But they landed like stones. I was the practice run. The first draft. This new baby, his biological child, would be the real thing. It was then that I began my own retreat. I spent my hours at the school library, at a part-time job in a quiet local bookstore, anywhere but home. I poured myself into my studies, not for Arthur's approval anymore, but for myself. I was building my own lifeboat, plank by plank, preparing for the day I could finally cast off from the shore. The baby, a boy they named Leo, arrived in a flurry of excitement. Arthur was besotted, a doting father in a way he had never been with me. He held Leo as if the baby were made of spun glass, whispering promises of all the things they would do together. I watched from the doorway of the hospital room, an invisible ghost in their perfect family picture. It was during those hospital visits that I first noticed the dissonant note in their happy symphony, Julian. Arthur's younger brother. Julian was everything Arthur was not: charming, cavalier, and effortlessly social. He'd built a successful tech startup and lived a life of casual wealth. He was a frequent visitor at the hospital, more frequent than a typical uncle. He brought extravagant gifts and had a way of looking at Amelia when Arthur's back was turned that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The pieces began to click into place with a slow, sickening dread. A late-night phone call Amelia ended abruptly when I entered the kitchen. A delicate gold bracelet on her wrist that I recognized as one Julian had given Clara years ago, a piece that had vanished from her jewelry box after she died. The way Amelia's face would light up when Julian's name was mentioned, an expression she would quickly try to mask. The final, undeniable proof came not from anything I saw, but from something I heard. It was past midnight, and I was on my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. I heard Amelia's hushed voice on the phone. "I know you want to see him, Jay," she whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of affection and frustration. "But you have to be more careful. Arthur is starting to notice how much attention you pay to Leo. We just have to be patient. When he's older, we'll figure out a way to tell him the truth about his real father." I stood frozen in the hallway, the words washing over me in a cold wave. His real father. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just an affair. It was a deception of monumental proportions, a lie placed right in the heart of our family, a baby presented as a symbol of new beginnings who was actually the product of a profound betrayal. I didn't confront her. I didn't run to Arthur. A colder, more calculating part of me, a part forged in years of quiet observation and emotional neglect, took over. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this information was a weapon. I didn't know when or how I would use it, but I knew I had to be patient. I had to gather undeniable proof. Because I sensed that a day was coming when Arthur would make his final move to cut me out of his life completely. And when that day came, I would be ready. The investigation became my silent obsession, a grim project I worked on in the margins of my life. For someone conducting such a high-stakes deception, Amelia was surprisingly careless, wrapped in the arrogance of believing no one would ever suspect her. Or perhaps she simply never considered me, the quiet, bookish stepdaughter, to be a threat. Her weekly spa day became my first point of focus. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., she would leave the house, impeccably dressed, and return 4 hours later with perfect nails and bags from expensive boutiques. The timing never added up. One Tuesday, I feigned a migraine and stayed home from school. I waited until her car disappeared down our long, winding driveway, then followed at a discreet distance in my beat-up sedan. She didn't drive to the spa downtown. She drove to the Osprey, a luxury boutique hotel nestled in a secluded cove 20 minutes north of the city. I parked across the road, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and watched as she walked into the lobby. 15 minutes later, Julian's sleek silver sports car pulled into the same parking lot. He got out, looked around briefly, and followed her inside. Seeing it was different from suspecting it. This was real. This was the shape of their betrayal. I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, and crawled back into bed. When Amelia returned, smelling of lavender and jasmine, she breezed into my room. "Feeling any better, sweetie?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. She held out her hand, displaying her perfectly manicured nails. "Look, a new color. Coral kiss. Do you like it?" "It's beautiful," I managed to say, the lie tasting like acid in my mouth. The evidence mounted. I found a receipt for a dinner for two at an absurdly expensive French restaurant, dated on a night Arthur was on a business trip and Amelia had claimed to be home with a sick headache. I found hotel receipts tucked into the pocket of a winter coat she rarely wore. And then there was Leo. As he grew from a tiny infant into a gurgling, curious baby, the resemblance became undeniable. He had Julian's dark, curly hair, his deep-set eyes, and a lopsided smile that was a mirror image of his uncle's. Arthur, blinded by paternal love, seemed to see only a perfect blend of himself and Amelia. I saw only Julian. The final piece of my grim puzzle was the DNA. I needed something clinical, irrefutable. Something that could not be explained away by coincidence or my overactive imagination, as Amelia often called it. Getting the samples was unnervingly simple. A few strands of Arthur's hair from his brush. A used water glass of Julian's left behind after a family dinner. And for Leo, a pacifier he dropped on the floor, which I quickly sealed in a plastic bag. I found a private lab in the next county, a small, discreet facility that asked few questions when presented with cash. I told the weary-looking technician it was for an advanced biology project. She nodded, barely glancing at the labeled bags. "Standard paternity analysis," she said, her voice flat. "Results in 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I went through the motions: school, work, family dinners where I watched the 3 adults at the center of this drama play their parts with practiced ease. The sealed envelope arrived on a drizzly Thursday afternoon. I drove to a park overlooking the ocean, the same park where Clara used to take me for picnics, and sat in my car, staring at my name on the front. My hands trembled as I tore it open. The language was cold and scientific, a series of genetic markers and statistical probabilities. But the conclusion was stark and absolute. The alleged father, Arthur Vance, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Vance. The probability of paternity for Julian Vance is 99.999%. I folded the papers, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt profoundly sad. This piece of paper held the power to shatter lives, to detonate a family. I drove home and tucked the envelope inside my worn copy of Jane Eyre, a story of another young woman fighting for her place in an unforgiving world. I knew its moment would come. I just had to wait for Arthur to provide the stage. He did, on the morning of my high school graduation. The ceremony was to be held in the school's cavernous gymnasium. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax and the excited chatter of hundreds of families. I found my assigned seat among my fellow graduates, a sea of blue gowns and hopeful faces. I scanned the bleachers and found them: Arthur, looking stern and impatient in his expensive suit; Amelia, holding a placid Leo, her smile as bright and brittle as glass. The principal's speech about future horizons washed over me. The valedictorian spoke of dreams and possibilities. Then they began to call the names. With each name, a wave of cheers and applause would erupt from a different section of the bleachers. Proud parents, whistling siblings, beaming grandparents. Upton, Sarah. Valdez, Marco. My turn was next. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm. This was it. The culmination of 4 years of hard work. A moment that should have been about pride and celebration. Vance, Alara. I stood up, smoothed the front of my gown, and started the long walk toward the stage. The gymnasium fell into a respectful hush. And in that silence, Arthur stood up. His voice, accustomed to commanding courtrooms, sliced through the quiet air. Before she accepts that diploma, there's something everyone should know. A collective, indrawn breath. Every head turned towards him. As of today, he announced, his voice cold and devoid of emotion, Alara is no longer my financial responsibility. I have fulfilled my obligation to her late mother. Her college fund is terminated. She is on her own. He paused, letting the words sink in. After all, she's not my real daughter, anyway. A bomb had gone off. The silence was absolute, then broken by a wave of shocked whispers. Phones, which had been pointed at the stage, now swiveled to capture my face, to capture this public, brutal severing. Amelia was tugging at Arthur's arm, her face a mask of horror, whispering, "Arthur, no, not here." But he stood his ground, arms crossed, looking at me with cold finality. I should have cried. I should have fled. That's what he expected. But in that moment of profound humiliation, I felt a strange and terrible calm wash over me. He had just handed me the stage, the audience, and the perfect cue. I didn't walk toward the diploma. I walked to the podium at the center of the stage. The principal started to intercept me, but I shook my head. "It's okay," I said, my voice surprisingly steady as it echoed through the microphone. "Since we're all sharing family secrets today, I have one of my own." I reached into the folder that held my diploma and pulled out the white envelope from the lab. The rustle of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the silent gym. "Arthur is right," I began, my eyes locked on his. His confident expression was beginning to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "I'm not his biological daughter. My mother, Clara, made sure I always knew the truth of my adoption. She also made sure I knew that biology doesn't make a family. Love does." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "But here's the thing about DNA and secrets," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Sometimes they reveal uncomfortable truths. For example, Arthur, your son, that beautiful baby boy you adore, he isn't your biological child, either." A massive, collective gasp. People were on their feet now, straining to see. Amelia's face had gone from horrified to ashen. She looked like she was going to be sick. "For the last year," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "your wife has been having an affair with your brother, Julian." Arthur's legs seemed to buckle. He sank back into his seat as if his strings had been cut. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Amelia made a choked, strangled noise and bolted. Clutching Leo to her chest, she scrambled through the rows of people, tripping in her high heels, fleeing the destruction I had just unleashed. "I have the DNA test results right here," I announced, holding up the papers for all to see. "Conclusive proof. 99.999% certainty that the father of her child is your brother." The gymnasium erupted. It was chaos. Shouting, pointing, the frantic clicking of phone cameras. I turned back to Arthur, who was staring up at me, his face a shattered mosaic of shock and betrayal. "You wanted to cut me off? You wanted to humiliate me," I said, my voice dropping but still carrying through the microphone. "Congratulations. You gave me the perfect opportunity to show you what a real family secret looks like." I tucked the papers back into my folder, walked to the table where the bewildered principal stood, and took my diploma from his trembling hand. "Thank you," I said quietly. Then I walked off the stage, down the steps, and out of the gymnasium, leaving the ruins of my family behind me. The drive away from the school was surreal. I didn't turn on the radio. The chaotic symphony of the gymnasium, the shouting, the gasps, the frantic murmuring was still ringing in my ears. I drove not to the house on the bluff, which had ceased to feel like home years ago, but to the small, one-bedroom apartment I had already secured with the money from my bookstore job, my lifeboat finally ready. My phone, which I had silenced for the ceremony, began to vibrate incessantly in my purse. When I finally looked at it, the screen was a cascade of missed calls and frantic texts from classmates, friends, and even numbers I didn't recognize. The story had gone viral before I'd even made it across town. Someone had live-streamed the entire confrontation. By nightfall, local news outlets had picked it up, branding it the graduation day bombshell. I watched the clip once, feeling a strange detachment, as if watching a character in a movie. The girl on the stage seemed so composed, so surgical in her delivery. She didn't look like she was in pain. She looked like she was in control. But as I sat alone in my sparsely furnished apartment, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. There was no triumph in this victory, only the bitter, metallic taste of wreckage. The fallout was swift and brutal. Amelia disappeared. A neighbor later reported seeing her frantically loading suitcases into her car late that night, Leo strapped into his car seat, before driving off into the darkness. Her social media, a carefully curated gallery of her perfect life, was scrubbed from the internet. She had simply vanished. Julian, through his lawyer, issued a terse statement denying the slanderous and fabricated accusations of a troubled young woman, but the damage was done. The publicly available video and my claim of having DNA proof were enough to ignite a firestorm in his business and social circles. Arthur, however, was the one who truly imploded. He filed for divorce the next day. He hired a private investigator who, within a week, confirmed everything I had revealed and more, a sordid trail of hotel bills, secret credit cards, and romantic getaways. The dual betrayal, from his wife and his own brother, shattered the foundations of his carefully ordered world. He retreated completely, not even leaving the house. The company he ran with such precision was suddenly rudderless. I felt no satisfaction in his collapse. I only felt a profound, weary sadness. I had thrown the stones, but now I had to live in the silence that followed the shattering of the glass house. A week later, I was coming home from a shift at the bookstore when I saw him sitting on the front steps of my apartment building. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and his face was etched with lines of sleeplessness and grief. He looked 10 years older. "Alara," he said, his voice a dry rasp as he stood up. I braced myself for anger, for accusations. But his eyes held only a vast, empty sorrow. "Can we talk? Please." We sat on a weathered bench in the building's small, neglected courtyard. For a long time, he just stared at his hands. "She knew," he said finally, his voice thick. "Clara. She knew." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a faded, cream-colored envelope. My name was on the front, written in my mother's elegant, familiar script. "She left this for you," he said, his voice cracking. "She told me to give it to you on your 18th birthday. I was a coward. I was afraid of what she might have said. About me." My hands trembled as I took the letter. The paper was soft with age. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I pray it means you have grown into the strong, wonderful woman I always knew you would be. There is something I must tell you, a burden I have carried alone. I know about Amelia and Julian. I've seen it in their stolen glances, their hushed conversations. I know. My first instinct was to rage, to expose, to protect my family with fire and fury. But then I looked at you, my darling girl, and I knew that was not the way. Your life should not be built on the rubble of other people's failings. You deserve a foundation of peace, not poison. So I made a choice. To love harder. To fill our home with so much light that the shadows could not take hold. And I made a promise to myself that you would always know, without a shadow of a doubt, that you are the most precious, wanted, and deeply loved daughter a mother could ever dream of. As for your father, be patient with him. His heart is a fortress, but you, my love, are the sea. He loves you more than he knows how to say. He is a good man who has been shaped by fear. When the time is right, help him find his way back to love. Choose forgiveness, not for his sake, but for yours. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You are my greatest joy, Alara. My starlight. My resilient girl. Never forget that. All my love, always. Mom." Tears blurred the words. Hot, silent tears for the mother who had loved me so fiercely, who had seen everything and chosen grace. Beside me, Arthur was weeping openly, his shoulders shaking with the force of his regret. I failed her, he whispered. I failed you both. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. I know it's too late. I know I don't deserve it. But can you ever forgive me? I looked at this broken man, my father, and I saw not the cold arbiter of my childhood, but a man drowning in a sea of his own making. And I heard Clara's words echoing in my mind. You, my love, are the sea. The anger I had held onto for so long, the hard knot of resentment in my chest, finally began to dissolve. Forgiveness wasn't about absolving him. It was about freeing myself. Yes, I said, my voice quiet but clear. I can. The word hung in the air between us, not a conclusion, but a beginning. A fragile bridge across a chasm of pain. In the months that followed, my life began to find a new, quieter rhythm. I started classes at the local university, majoring in social work. I kept my job at the bookstore, finding comfort in the scent of old paper and the quiet companionship of stories. Arthur and I began to build something new from the ruins. We started with weekly dinners at a small, unassuming diner halfway between my apartment and his house. Our conversations were stilted at first, full of awkward pauses. But slowly, carefully, we began to talk. He told me stories about his childhood, about meeting Clara, about the fears that had governed his life for so long. I told him about my classes, my dreams, the person I was becoming now that I was no longer defined by his expectations. One evening, he told me he had started a foundation in Clara's name, a charity dedicated to supporting adoptive families and children in the foster care system. I've been reading her journals, he said, his eyes misty. She wrote so much about you. About the day we brought you home. She called you her starlight. I was so blind, Alara. The greatest gift of my life was right in front of me, and I was too afraid to see it. His words no longer held the power to validate me. My sense of self-worth was no longer tied to his approval. But they were a balm on an old wound, a quiet acknowledgement of a love that had been there all along, buried under layers of fear. I began volunteering at the foundation, spending my Saturday afternoons at a local community center, helping children who were navigating the same confusing labyrinth of adoption and foster care that I had. I would sit with them, not as a counselor, but as someone who understood. I told them stories, not the dramatic story of my graduation, but the quiet story of Clara's love, of finding my own strength, of learning that family is not about biology, but about who shows up, who stays, who loves you when you are at your most unlovable. One afternoon, a quiet 10-year-old girl named Maya, who had been in 3 foster homes in 2 years, looked up at me from her drawing. Is it scary, she asked, to let someone be your family? I thought for a moment, remembering the fortress of Arthur's heart, the betrayal of Amelia and Julian, the fierce, protective love of Clara. Yes, I said honestly, sometimes it's terrifying. But it's also the most beautiful and worthwhile thing you will ever do. The secret is, you get to choose. You build your family out of the people who see your light and aren't afraid of it. You build it out of love and forgiveness and second chances. I looked across the room and saw Arthur standing in the doorway, watching us. He wasn't a man of easy smiles, but there was a softness in his eyes I had never seen before. He gave me a small, hesitant nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a sign of respect, of partnership, of a father finally seeing his daughter for who she truly was. My name is Alara Vance. It fits me now. It is the name of a woman who was chosen by a mother with a boundless heart, and who, in turn, chose to be a daughter to a father who was brave enough to learn how to love. It is the name of someone who learned that the most powerful truths aren't the ones you use to tear a world down, but the ones you use to build a new one, piece by gentle, resilient piece. And that, I have come to realize, is a story worth telling. This story of graduation revenge had you on the edge of your seat? Hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Zoe pulled out that DNA test and watched Michelle's face turn white as she realized her secret was exposed. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this.